Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to Dubliners 2019, a reading series started in the brainchild of my buddy Alan over at Big Hard Books and Classics, and particularly I think in March and April he and I and some other booktubers were reading stories from James Joyce's short story collection Dubliners, his first really kind of published book, and kind of talking about individual stories. And Alan had the idea of finishing that up by talking about the dead this month, here right at the end of 2019. So I wanted to talk about the short story, The Dead. Before I do that, I want to talk about James Joyce just in general. I probably have said this before. I know a lot of people find the idea of reading Joyce to be intimidating, and maybe so intimidating that it'd be a waste of time. And let me just say that if that's the way you feel about Joyce, Dubliners is the place to start. Because Dubliners contains none of the experimental stream of consciousness, play with language that you find in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, or Ulysses, or in Finnegan's Wake. That this is a great place to start, because one of the arguments I make all the time is that Joyce is just also a very good writer. And I think these stories prove it. Without any kind of literary pyrotechnics or experimentalism that's evident, or that you would need to be able to pick up on to understand the stories, these stories are just oftentimes really good stories. So The Dead is, I think, probably acknowledged, and many people feel like The Dead is Joyce's best story. There was a movie made out of it in the 80s starring Angelica Houston. And it was directed by her father, John Huston, which, kind of brought the story back and brought James Joyce back just a little bit to public attention. And while this story is full of symbolism and illusion and things like that, it's also just a good, interesting, poignant story. And if you look at the collection Dubliners, the first story in Dubliners is Araby, which is my favorite Joyce short story, and one of my favorite short stories of all times. And then you read The Dead. I think you'll find they end on a really similar note, with a man who is in love, but who is frustrated by his inability to consummate that love, to connect fully with the person he loves. And they end on kind of, I think, a similar note, which, if you read the whole collection, maybe you'll pick up on. So The Dead is ostensibly the story of an upper middle class, educated Irish Catholic man who lives in Dublin. His name is Gabriel Conroy, and Mr. Conroy and his wife Greta are going to a dinner party hosted and given every year annually by his two spinster aunts, who also provide a home to one of his nieces. His spinster aunts were and are great singers, musicians, as is his niece, and music plays a large role in the first part of the story. So to me, The Dead can be divided into two parts of the story. There's the part of the story about the party itself, and then there's the part of the story about Gabriel and his wife once the party is over. So to me, this first part of the story is Joyce is doing two things. Number one, I think he's trying to represent every level of Irish Catholic society in Dublin around the turn of the 20th century that he possibly can. There are wealthy spinster aunts, there are young men dissipated by drink, there are talented young people with no way to really turn their talent into a future for themselves, there are relatively comfortable middle-class Irish Catholics who are perhaps unwilling to take a risk on supporting Irish independence, and who at the same time may be making compromises with England-backed Irish Protestants. There's the hinted at the problems of the working class and young kind of servant class people. There is a Protestant character who is, I think, incredibly confident, and who represents, I think, that kind of confidence that came from Irish Protestants at the time, because they had the full backing of the English government. There's the power of tradition, the importance of music, the problems of marriage, the problems of alcoholism. I think there's kind of a microcosm of Irish Catholic Dublin society from somewhere between middle class maybe to the lower levels of the upper middle class represented in the Dead, and that show up at this dinner party. And Joyce describes the meal they eat in detail, and he describes the actions of the party almost on a moment by moment, hour by hour basis. And at the same time, he's characterizing Gabriel Conroy. Conroy is an educated man who considers himself an honorable man, who can be counted on by friends and family to do the right thing, and yet he is non-confrontational to the point of almost impotence. It's not that he's a coward necessarily, it's just that he chooses to avoid confrontational situations. Early on in the story, he's confronted by a young woman who disagrees with his decision to write book reviews for the Protestant Dublin newspaper in Ireland, and considers him to be something of a traitor to the Irish Catholic population of Dublin. Anyway, the first part of the story is really all about the dinner party, and you meet a lot of characters, and you see a lot of interaction there, and there are all these kind of things going on that kind of, I think, exemplify the different parts of Dublin society. And then when the party's over, you get essentially a very short part of the story, which just focuses on Gabriel and his wife Greta, and we learn about his physical desire for his wife, and how he is hoping that this night will end in sex for him, and how he really hopes that to be true. And I think, oftentimes in Joyce, I think sex is just sex. I think here he's hoping that sex would create some kind of a bridge across a gap that's grown between he and his wife, and at kind of the moment when it appears as though they're going to move towards having sex, his wife begins crying and tells him something from her past that's not particularly controversial at all. It's not scandalous at all. It's just something that kind of puts Gabriel off, and they don't end up having sex. And we have to assume that this relationship that they've had, which is growing colder and more distant, just continues on in that way. Anyway, you should read The Dead. It won't take you very long. It's kind of a long, short story, but it won't take you very long, and it is a classic, and I think it's a great story, and it's well written. So I think that's Dubliners 2019. Thanks to Alan for the idea and for hosting this. It's been fun. I love Joyce's short stories, and it's been fun getting to look at them again. Anyway, if you've read The Dead or any of the other stories from Dubliners, please let me know in the comments section below, and as always, thank you for watching.